Okay. For coming in person and for on Zoom. Thanks to Derek Room for setting this up. I'm Dan Slater. I'm the director of the Weiser Center for Emerging Democracies, or WCED. Today, we're very, very happy to have a lecture from one of our very own, Adam Casey, who is a postdoctoral fellow at WCED for this year and next. A lot of you have hopefully had a chance to meet Adam. He's an extraordinary individual, extraordinary scholar. He published not just one, but 2 articles in World Politics not too long ago after finishing his PhD at University of Toronto in 2020. He's going to be speaking to us today about his first book project, first of 2 book projects he's currently working on. Today's talk will be called Aiding Autocrats, Foreign Support and Authoritarian Rule. And we'll be open up to Q&A via Zoom. Please feel free to use the Q&A function to write questions during, and I'll curate those at the end. But this is really great material. Adam's been collecting just an astonishing amount of data on the features of militaries, on the nature of rebellions and the like. So he really knows what he speaks, and it's going to be a great presentation. So Adam, thanks for doing this, and thanks everybody for coming.
Thanks, Dan. So thanks to Dan for that far too generous introduction. And I want to thank both WCED for hosting me these past couple of years and for hosting this talk, as well as for Crease for co-sponsoring this talk today. So as Dan mentioned, I'm Adam Casey. I'm a postdoctoral fellow here at the Weiser Center for Emerging Democracies. I'm a political scientist, which among other things means I'm okay being interrupted during the talk. So if you have something that you'd like to ask me about midway through, please do interrupt. I don't mind at all. I also talk very quickly. I will try my best to not do that, but I will almost invariably fail. So this talk is based on my book manuscript, as Dan mentioned, perpetually nearly finished. So I'm really looking forward to your comments and hopefully getting some new readers when it eventually comes up. So I think we should consider for a moment South Vietnamese President Ngo Dinh Diem. It might not seem obvious now, but in the early 1960s, he was actually in a seemingly enviable position. So Diem faced an escalating insurgency by the communist-led National Liberation Front, as well as a threat of a North Vietnamese invasion. But neither of these were as yet a serious challenge to his government. And at this point, he'd sidelined most major rivals. He went from controlling his palace grounds in 1954 to being the undisputed leader of South Vietnam. And he defeated large and well-armed political religious organizations which threatened his rule. He was receiving massive economic and military support from a very powerful foreign patron, the United States of America. He was America's miracle man in Saigon, seen as critical to the survival of a non-communist Vietnam. Yet Diem still had to contend with the political unreliability of his own armed forces. Unfortunately for Diem, his powerful foreign patron was much more helpful for his first sets of problems than the second. In 1960, he faced a coup attempt from his American-trained forces that very nearly succeeded. During the putsch, the United States remained largely on the sidelines and waited to see who would come out on top. 3 years later, a long-plotted military coup finally did succeed, and the US again failed to defend their client ruler. A man once viewed as critical to the stability of a non-communist Vietnam was executed at the hands of his own officers. Now, Diem was not the only autocrat who had to fear his own military officers. Consider for a moment Ethiopian dictator Mengistu Haile Mariam. So Mengistu, too, was immensely concerned about the political reliability of his military. He faced powerful elites from the regime that he and his fellow officers had deposed in 1974. He faced multiple insurgencies on different fronts on Ethiopian territory, highly mobilized right and left-wing political opposition groups. Like Mengistu, enjoyed the support of a very powerful patron, the Soviet Union. Large-scale Soviet military support would allow him to build the largest army in sub-Saharan Africa. However, unlike Diem, Mengistu's patron was willing to provide support the United States was unwilling to offer. Moscow provided support in reducing the threat posed to his rule by his own military officers. The Soviets provided logistical and material support centered around ensuring the political reliability of the Ethiopian officer corps. These were political commissars and security services embedded directly in the armed forces. Now, unlike in South Vietnam, these Soviet-assisted measures were really unpopular. An increasingly dismal battlefield performance by the Ethiopian military culminated in a coup attempt launched from the highest echelons of the Ethiopian armed forces in 1989. But unlike his South Vietnamese counterpart, Mengistu had the aid of expansive security services created with Soviet assistance. These organizations uncovered this coup plot and violently crushed it. Unlike his South Vietnamese counterpart, it would be Mengistu carrying out executions of his officers. Mengistu survived in office under arguably even more challenging circumstances than Diem for nearly twice as long. He even outlasted the typical autocracy, regimes that face far fewer threats to his rule than he did. So how do we explain this variation? We've learned a lot about authoritarian durability over the last 20 years, but we know surprisingly less about the world of client dictatorships. Our conventional wisdom is that great power patrons prop up all client dictatorships. People argue that dictators survived because of American support and because of Soviet support. This was apparently true of France, and people have cited the resilience of contemporary Arab autocracies as resulting from the amount of support they're getting from the United States. And we have a lot of reasons why we might expect foreign support to shore up the rule of client dictatorships. Foreign patrons provide economic resources that can be used to sort of buy off support within the regime. They provide military aid, which both increases the coercive capacity of the government and reduces incentives for military coups. It also emboldens autocrats who might feel willing to lash out against opposition because they feel protected by a foreign patron. And it arguably, the perception that a foreign patron keeps a regime in power might even dissuade opposition mobilization. And some, although I'm going to hopefully cast a lot of doubt on this, have argued all foreign sponsors prevent military coups. So all of these factors were arguably important to some extent in both Vietnam and Ethiopia. But there was a lot of variation. Why didn't American patronage save Diem, and why did the Soviet patronage help keep Mengistu in power so long? Is it really the case that regimes owe their durability to foreign patrons? This is something that's generally assumed and actually rarely analyzed systematically. So what I do in this paper, or this book, I guess, not a paper anymore, is I provide the first cross-national overtime analysis of the impact of foreign support on the survival of autocratic regimes. I do this by generating original data on all foreign-backed dictatorships from 1945 until 2010. I define a client regime, you can disagree with me and we can talk about that in the Q&A, as an authoritarian political regime whose tenure of foreign sponsor makes serious effort to protect from potential internal or external threats. I view serious effort as material support, so both money, direct budgetary support and grant military aid, so not military sales, and organizational support, so training security forces, deploying advisors, even direct military intervention. So this is a time-varying measure of all autocratic regimes since 1945, which allows us to compare client regimes to each other and also to other autocracies. By my measure, roughly a third of autocracies count as client regimes. And I cover for all patrons. So I move from the autocratic regime up rather than saying who are all American clients. I look at every single autocratic regime and I determine the nature of its foreign support available to it, if any.
So does it matter what the power differential is between the patron and the client? Or is it really, so for instance, if there's a foreign sponsor making a serious effort, but that's also a very strong power, strong regime?
Yeah.
Is it really just about the support itself?
So that's a great question. So in terms of the measure, no, the hierarchy and sort of power between client and patron doesn't actually enter into it. I mean, so, for example, like, is Canada a client of the United States? I mean, no. I mean, it's not a client dictatorship, so it wouldn't enter into my analysis. But, so I can talk about why it isn't the strength of the regime receiving the support initially that accounts for all the variation. But in terms of the measure, no. So like Egypt sponsors a regime in North Yemen. The power differential is serious, but not as big as between the United States and Nicaragua. So there is some variation there. But OK, so when we look at overall client regimes, if we look in the top left panel here, we see that clients in green, on average, they do survive longer than non-sponsored autocracies. So autocracies that receive foreign support last on average, and it's statistically significant, longer than other autocracies. But that collapses all foreign sponsors together. If we separate by who the foreign sponsor is, we see that actually this relationship is accounted for almost entirely by the Soviet Union. So up here in red, Soviet client regimes survive far longer than other autocracies and other client regimes. And US regimes actually look very similar to typical autocracies. They don't survive in office much less than regular autocracies, but not much more. There's kind of no actually statistically significant effect of US support on client regime survival. And this book is going to be about why that's the case, why this variation. So Another way of just looking at this quickly, these are pooled annual breakdown rates. So essentially, in any given year, an autocratic regime has something like a 5% chance of collapsing in any given year. For Soviet clients, that's less than 1%. For American clients, that's 4.6. So it's a little bit less than other autocracies, but there's a huge variation between US and Soviet clients. So what's going on here? So my argument focuses on how different regime support strategies pursued by Moscow and Washington shaped domestic institutions and client regimes, and how these institutions in turn shape the relative vulnerability of client regimes to military coups. The US pursued a model focused on building effective and autonomous, nonpartisan client militaries. They did not build authoritarian ruling institutions, and in fact pushed clients to embrace the trappings of liberal democracy and refrain from politicizing the armed forces. By contrast, the Soviet Union pursued a model of building Leninist parties and partisan armies. Soviet clients were under no pressure, and until very late in perestroika, only minimal pressure to liberalize. But the Soviets, as I'll show later, did actually preach policy moderation in a way that was commonly misunderstood. Now, these different strategies had really different consequences for regime survival. Military coups are the most common way that autocratic regimes lose power. And by effectively eliminating the risk of a military coup, Soviet clients lasted in power much longer than other autocracies. American sponsorship did not prevent military coups and even made them worse in some cases. And the US accepted coups in client regimes as fait accompli. Therefore, institutions in many of these regimes were actually endogenous to foreign sponsorship. Party rule and even communism was a consequence of Soviet sponsorship rather than a cause. And military rule and militarization in American clients was a consequence of American support over the long term. So to convince you of this, I'm going to do a few things in this presentation. I'm going to go over my central argument for both Soviet and American client regimes. I'll discuss how these institutions shaped regime survival. I'll discuss mostly on coups, but I'll focus a little bit on war and battlefield effectiveness. I'm then going to turn to the future of partisan armies. And during the Q&A, I can cover all of my appendices, which is more about the data and the kind of full statistical results if people are not convinced. All right. So the Soviet Union and the United States were actually both born of revolution. They were born of very different revolutions in very different times. But the strategies that they pursued in client regimes were actually in part a reflection of their own domestic civil military orders and political military relations. So, like most Marxists, the Bolsheviks in Russia were deeply distrustful of the military. They viewed militaries in general as aristocratic and bourgeois institutions that helped dominate and sort of subdue and repress the proletarian and peasant elements in countries. And so Trotsky wrote a lot on the military before he came into power, and he was the man tasked with building the Red Army. And so he wrote, quote, "The old army had a ruling apparatus which was constructed, organized, and educated so as to ensure that the army automatically served the ruling class of those days with the monarchy as its summit." And actually, the American founders were similarly deeply suspicious of the army and its service to the crown and tyrannical rule. At the Constitutional Convention, James Madison memorably stated, "A standing military force with an overgrown executive will not long be safe companions to liberty. The means of defense against foreign danger have been always the instruments of tyranny at home." But the Soviet Union and the United States took very different and, in fact, diametrically opposite approaches to dealing with the problem of the army. The Soviet solution was a thorough politicization of the army that would subordinate and tie the army to the ruling regime, and the American solution was separation and depoliticization. Neither were unequivocally successful, but these were importantly very different strategies. So the Soviet model involved tying the army to the ruling party and subordinating it to party rule. This would be actually one of the Soviet Union's not well understood, but one of their most important organizational exports, which is ironic given their disdain for armies and even the ambiguity the Bolsheviks had for what a revolutionary state could or would even look like after the revolution. But this was a really radical organizational innovation that would ultimately spread far beyond the borders of the Soviet Union. So the Soviet partisan army had essentially three main parts. So first, they had an institution called political commissars. So these guys' names actually changed throughout the Soviet Union, but I'll call them commissars throughout. These were officers who reported to the party, not the military chain of command, that served directly alongside professional military officers. In the early Soviet Union, under Voyeначалие, the system of dual command, they actually helped command military units too. And anything the regular military commander wanted to order, the commissar had to agree to. So this was a tremendous amount. The commissar's most important responsibility was monitoring the political reliability of the professional officers. Anytime the professional officer did anything suspicious of sort of, not supporting the regime, the political commissar could report on that officer up the party chain of command. The second was military counterintelligence. So in the Soviet Union, these were called the special departments. These were also embedded alongside the regular officers, and these reported to the massive secret police service the Soviet Union had created, the Bolsheviks had created shortly after they seized power. So these reported on both the officers and the commissars up the security service chain of command and could arrest officers who engaged in any insubordination. And the third is that the army was thoroughly penetrated by party committees, and officers were signed up to the party en masse. So as the Soviet Union continued to evolve, party membership became all but a prerequisite for advancement in the army, and your political reliability was assessed every time you went up for promotion by how you behaved and how you talked about the party and the regime leadership. So this is a really complex web of monitoring mechanisms embedded directly in the military, which made acts of insubordination extremely difficult. They both reduced the incentives for military coups by tying party members to the regime, and they made them exceptionally difficult to pull off. Military coups require some degree of plotting to happen in secret beforehand, and having embedded mechanisms in units of regime monitoring made it really hard for officers to approach each other. And this meant that the Soviet army was remarkably loyal to the regime, even in situations where we would imagine a coup would have been all but inevitable. So if you think about Stalin's purges of the army high command, 65% of those officers who had a brigade command position or above in 1936 were executed by the end of the purges. The massive assault on the corporate and individual institutions of the Soviet army went unopposed, in part because of these large security services the Soviets had created. Now, the American model was very, very different from this. America was a democracy for propertied white men, and sought kind of a, so it built a really different army than the revolutionary regime that was emerging in communist Russia. And it sought the solution to the military problem by keeping the military dispersed, small, balanced by the militia, and nonpartisan. So Congress controlled all, and to this day controls all military promotions. So it had a way of ensuring that military officers, remained kind of loyal to the constitutional government in the United States. And the United States was really anti-military for much of its history. And I'll talk about when that changed and the consequences in a second. But I mean, in 1802, the Treasury Secretary could say, the distribution of our little army to distant garrisons where hardly any other inhabitant is to be found is the most eligible arrangement of that perhaps necessary evil that can be contrived. So the United States military model was very different than the Soviets. And these two countries suddenly found themselves in a very different position after 1945. So World War II was the crucible through which both America and the Soviet Union emerged as superpowers. The Soviet Union bore the brunt of fighting Nazi Germany, and when the war's end, Soviet soldiers stood from the Elbe River in Germany here all the way to halfway through Korea, which is an absolutely massive expanse of territory under Soviet control. The United States had almost single-handedly defeated Japan, and its troops stretched from Korea to Germany. So both countries emerged with newfound power and actually extreme prestige. Their armies also emerged with extreme prestige. The Red Army had defeated Nazi Germany, and the United States Army also had performed tremendously in the war. And so both were extremely prestigious and powerful new countries that also had new responsibilities. They were on a search for security that would actually lend them into a growing Cold War with one another, and a search for allies, and in a position where they needed to cultivate a range of subordinate clients. Now, when the Soviets thought about solidifying their gains after 1945, they realized there was a kind of subversive threat to Soviet client regimes. There's a kind of a counter-revolution problem in Soviet clients. So Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana provides a really instructive example of the difficulties of building the Soviet-style system of political military relations. So Nkrumah inherited his British-trained and actually British-led army intact from colonial rule. So a white officer was the head of the Ghanaian army until 1961, some 4 years after independence. And this army was full of officers who had trained under colonial rule, had trained in Sandhurst, and had very few ties to his ruling party. Now, Nkrumah had got increasingly radical in his own domestic political beliefs. And was really inspired by kind of some of the gains of the Soviet Union. And so, but this army posed a serious problem to his regime. And so what Nkrumah did is he started copying the Soviet model. So he strengthened his ruling party. He started building up counterweights to the army. He built up a new security service. And he introduced a plan to embed political commissars in the army. Now, the army correctly viewed this as a serious threat to its corporate interests and struck back in a coup that toppled him in 1966. So this means imposing the kind of Soviet model in a place with an existing army without Soviet help was really, really difficult for autocratic regimes. And so the Soviet Union would end up playing a key role in embedding these institutions in different client regimes. So there are essentially 3 ways that Soviet clients that the Soviet Union ended up kind of building its own model of civil-military relations in its client regimes. So first, in some cases, the Soviet Union directly imposed new client regimes. So when the Soviets stood from the Elbe to Korea, they ended up putting in power a lot of different communist groups. And in these cases, they built new partisan armies from scratch. So that's one way that the Soviets built partisan armies. But there were 2 other ways that weren't imposed directly by the Soviet Union. So first, they aided revolutions that were happening on their own. So in Mozambique, Angola, Albania, China, Vietnam, Cuba, and South Yemen, pro-Soviet revolutionary groups received Soviet assistance during and after the revolutions in building armies along the Soviet model. And in some cases, like especially Angola, South Yemen, and Mozambique, the Soviet Union played a very critical role. It's difficult to think of the Angolan revolutionaries successfully consolidating power over their own army without the Soviet Union, and I can talk about that later. And third, in a kind of least likely case, in the kind of Nkrumahs of the world, where Soviet assistance was actually made available, unlike in Ghana, they built party armies through the presence of large-scale Soviet advisory deployments. So the Soviets helped build partisan armies in Afghanistan, Czechoslovakia, Ethiopia, Egypt, Syria, and Somalia, in part by the presence of Soviet advisors. So Soviet clients were really happy to receive support in creating partisan armies because they too feared being overthrown by their own militaries. So Hafizullah Amin, who at the time was a kind of second or third in command in Afghanistan, but would later rise to heading the communist regime there, he told a visiting Soviet general, "We need the political security agencies, politorgani, like you have. No need to change anything, everything as you have it. We just want the exact model that you have here. How can you help us build it?" And the Soviets devoted extensive efforts to building new security services. In Eastern Europe, they played a very intimate role in designing security services, but this was actually common across Soviet client regimes. Even in South Yemen, the South Yemeni revolutionaries called their security service Chekists in honor of their Soviet advisors. The Soviet Union invariably built a really similar kind of model in all of these different countries. There was some important variation, but political commissars were present nearly everywhere. Military and counterintelligence was present, and large kind of party-controlled security services to monitor the army were present. So the Soviets pushed building a partisan army, and they also pushed client regimes to build parties. So there was a reason why Soviet clients were less keen to build effective parties than party armies for the exact same reasons the Soviets wanted them to build them. So why the Soviets wanted parties was they feared that, client dictators feared that the Soviets would create a pool of potential replacements for them if the Soviets kind of tired of their individual leadership. So in Ethiopia, Mengistu was under consistent pressure from the Soviet Union to build a party, but he was worried that if he created an effective party institution, the Soviets may tire of his poor battlefield performance and other actions taken by him, and they might have a good pool of replacements to kind of, to support a party coup against Mengistu. So, the Soviets pushed building a partisan army, and they also pushed client regimes to build parties. So there was a reason why the Soviets pushed building a partisan army, and they also pushed client regimes to build parties. So client dictators feared that, that means Soviet clients really delayed and subverted party building. The Soviets pushed party building, but these parties often didn't resemble the kind of strength of the Soviets' own party. It was more in the partisan armies that were actually successful, because there you had a much greater convergence of Soviet and client interests. So conversely, American clients had a kind of revolution problem. You can read all this text while I drink water. I'm just kidding. OK, so there were really 4 key events in the early Cold War that shaped American foreign policy towards autocratic client regimes. So in 1949, the Communist Revolution succeeded in China and ousted what had been a very troublesome client for the United States in the KMT. In 1950, the Korean War really changed Americans' view about the problems of communism in Asia. The French defeat in Indochina and the ascendance of the communist-led Viet Minh was a major turning point for American views of the importance of communism in Asia. And finally, the Cuban Revolution fundamentally transformed America's views of its vulnerability to communist revolution in its kind of near area. And so Thailand is a very instructive example of a regime that went from US disinterest and actually very negative American view of the regime to a key linchpin ally, all because of these transformations. So in 1947, a military coup overthrew a kind of brief period of relative democracy in Thailand. And it was led by a general who had actually been an ally of Japan, of fascist Japan in World War II. And this coup could not have exasperated the United States more. The United States, Thailand was a backwater at the time in terms of US interests. The US had relatively limited leverage over Thailand because it had relatively few connections to it, but was not at all in favor of this military coup, right? The US at this time was kind of only slowly coming around to the problem of needing to support client dictatorships anyway. And so a kind of pro-fascist military regime in Thailand was hardly a government that was going to get a lot of American support. But the Chinese Revolution in 1949 really changed the attractiveness of a Thai military regime. So this was a Thai military regime offering support to the United States, had clear anti-communist credentials, and suddenly, especially with the outbreak of the Korean War, started to look like a much more necessary ally for the United States. And so the United States goes from actively opposing a Thai military government to creating a military assistance and advisory group and pouring advisors and military resources into building up the Thai military and building a client regime in Thailand. Now, the United States government built very different militaries in its client regimes than the Soviet Union did. So the United States sought to build autonomous, centralized, nonpartisan armies, and they really pushed client governments to centralizing military control under a single military force. So in Nicaragua, the United States had intervened multiple times, but its most recent intervention was in 1927, and decided to build a new army for Nicaragua. They dissolved the existing army and built a new one entirely from scratch. And this army it concentrated all power of promotions within the army in the hands of the guard commander, who would later become Somoza, someone that would become a little bit notorious in Nicaraguan history. It eliminated all other security services, and it built a kind of, in theory, nonpartisan army that would help sort of bring stability and they thought at the time democracy to Nicaragua, but this army would end up being the kind of launching pad for a decades-long Somoza dictatorship based on the army. Now, the United States viewed army building as key to client stability. In Vietnam, Eisenhower, quote, believed a strong army was the key to prerequisite for a strong government rather than the other way around. And for the political scientists, this is the exact inverse of Huntington. I mean, this is a very different model of civil military relations. In Dominican Republic and Haiti, the United States did the same thing. In Philippines, they built new, nonpartisan, highly centralized, highly autonomous armies built kind of on the American model. And in the Dominican Republic, a man named Trujillo was put in charge of that military, and we sort of know how that one ends as well. Now, America obviously wanted effective anti-communist armies and client governments. It built militaries in its own image. It pushed clients to leave the army alone and to keep politics out, to promote competent officers. The United States and South Vietnam was constantly trying to pressure the government to stop interfering in military issues. But the thing is this kind of push to build an autonomous, apolitical army was a huge threat to client governments. So the more powerful the Vietnamese military got, the more it could actually threaten Diem's own rule in South Vietnam. And in fact, the United States was more concerned about building an effective military than it was in keeping him in power at all. And so he faced a really serious threat of a military coup. So US clients weren't puppets. And so they dealt with this problem by doing all the things other autocrats do. They interfered in promotions in the military. They tried to put cronies in top command positions. They tried to split their security services into different overlapping institutions. But all of these things are, coup-proofing strategies lead to coups very frequently. So the very efforts you take, just like Nkrumah in the earlier example, to reduce your vulnerability to a military coup, often leads to the very thing it was meant to prevent. And in US clients, these coups were accepted by the United States. This meant that American clients were extremely vulnerable to military coups, and the United States government was not protecting them for the effects, or was not aiding them directly in coup proofing. And beyond that, the United States, what institutions the US built other than militaries and client dictatorships was mostly pushing for kind of formal trappings of democracy. So, it's not clear the US would have known how to or been interested in building a kind of Leninist totalitarian party in its client governments. And so the United States was mostly pushing clients to hold, somewhat, farcical elections of kind of, dubious quality. But when there was a coup in 1961 in Korea, the United States pushed Park very quickly. You have to resign your commission from the army. You got to wear a suit, not the military uniform. You need to run for elections. These elections were heavily manipulated, but that was okay with the United States. The United States pushed clients to kind of at least have the kind of trappings of democracy, and didn't really help client governments build, effective authoritarian ruling institutions. In Laos, the United States government was actually really convinced that the anti-communist slate of electors would win in kind of competitive elections, and so they kept pushing the Lao government to not engage in too much fraud, which they thought would actually undermine support for the government. And in the CIA's own history of these elections, there was a moment where an RLA officer of the Royal Lao Army had written out the vote totals for the Pathet Lao, the communist group in Laos, and wrote like 0 or something. Like they had won no seats in this thing. And he said, come on, they won more than that. And he said, okay, well, what year were you born? And then he wrote 1927 in the vote total for the communists, right? So the United States on occasion tried to get client governments to make kind of less ham-fisted attempts to manipulate elections, but often didn't really have any leverage over them in that area. So this is a really instructive memo from the Central Intelligence Agency about what the US viewed as how it should respond to coups in client regimes. So this is from 1974, which is actually a period of brief democracy in Thailand. In 1976, a coup would happen, and the US basically did this exact thing. So the United States said, CIA analyst for the director said, the US response to a military coup in Thailand, or coup attempt, should be governed by the following guidelines. We recognize it is in our interest to continue a close relationship with almost any Thai government that may emerge from a coup. If coup plotters tell us in advance of their plans and seek our support, we should withhold that support. Something's redacted, I don't know what they say here. If we intervene in any way to prevent a coup, and that coup then succeeds, we'd merely prejudice our future relations with the new Thai government. And during any coup attempt, the US should maintain a low profile, remain detached from the situation, but should continue all assistance programs and contacts with government at present levels. And once a coup has succeeded and the dust is settled, we should in a low key express acceptance of that situation. So this is just a memo of what we should do, but the US actually did basically exactly this 2 years later. Korea, we also have the benefit of 2 remarkably frank memoirs written by the ambassador to Korea and the head of the US military command in Korea. And there was a coup in 1979 that's covered really extensively in both these guys' memoirs. And it's amazing that despite literal joint command of Korean forces, the US didn't know about the coup ahead of time, was sort of figured out a coup was going on as it was happening, and decided, well, look, we don't want a coup, but the worst case scenario is a failed coup that splits the Korean army and they start fighting each other, and this invites North Korean attack. And so the ambassador says, look, what am I going to do? Order American troops out to fight against a coup, so they're fighting Korean troops. So they say, look, we don't have anything we can do about a coup. We don't want a coup, but there's nothing we can do to prevent it. So we're just going to accept it if it happens. And in fact, the US aid to the Korean government had built an army that was really capable and of launching coups and actually fairly interventionist. And so the US it wasn't that the US wanted coups to overthrow client regimes, although in some cases it did. But it was that kind of the model that we pushed on a lot of these governments ended up creating militaries that were capable of launching coups and an American response that was accepting of those coups once they occurred. So in short, both foreign patrons pursued institutional solutions to a kind of dictator problem. So alliances with autocrats are problematic for both Moscow and Washington. So not all autocracies fall prey to kind of excessive concentration of power in the hands of an individual autocrat, or personalization in the kind of political science term, but it's a latent risk everywhere. And the US and the Soviets were both anxious about the problem of too much concentration of power in the hand of individual client autocrats. These individuals could be erratic, irrational, and they could drag patrons into conflicts. And succession is a big issue. If the only person in the regime that's pro-Soviet is the dictator and they're overthrown, the Soviets could lose their position. And so they tried to solve this problem in two different ways. The Soviets did so through the party, which helped give them a kind of pool of potential replacements for the dictator, and the party army, which helped these regimes not get overthrown by kind of counter-revolutionary forces. And the United States, the Soviets viewed the Politburo as a far safer place for new leaders than the barracks. The Americans pursued military assistance, which would solve both the dictator and revolution problems. American-backed militaries might be able to remove erratic dictators who are sort of, in Brazil, the Americans viewed, the Goulart as not, like he was a fellow traveler of the communists, and he wasn't a communist, but he was too weak on the communists, and so the army could step in and remove him. And the army also helped solve the kind of revolution problem. All right, so how well did this stuff work? So these two, hopefully I've tried to make the case that the United States and the Soviet Union pursued two different strategies. How did they actually affect regime survival and military coups in particular? And so what this is we look here at the sort of effects of sponsorship, American sponsorship, and then I didn't talk about it in this talk, but I have data on the French and the British. So we see the outcome we're looking at here is regime-ending military coups. Overall, sponsorship significantly reduces the likelihood of regime-ending military coup. There's 0 Soviet regime-ending military coups in any clients, and so adding it in here, the coefficient would be like very, very big. But we look that if you split it up, American, French, and British, they don't actually reduce the risk of a regime-ending military coup in any statistically significant way. So this is just to add some controls if you're not convinced. So these are kind of domestic institutional features of autocratic regimes, and we see that American support still fails to statistically significantly reduce the impact of regime-ending military coups, even if you include a series of important controls. Now, partisan armies, the sort of Soviet-built partisan armies, really substantially reduce the risk of military coups. So here, if you just look at the armies that have commissars, which are almost all Soviet clients, they're far, far less of a risk of military coups. And if you include commissars along with sponsorship, this little triangle, so Model 5, sponsorship is no longer statistically significant. So foreign sponsorship, in addition to the effects it had on regime survival through coup vulnerability, there's actually pretty strong evidence that foreign sponsorship played a role in reducing the battlefield effectiveness of client militaries. So Cambodia, in a way that would presage by about 60 years the American experience in Afghanistan as recently as last summer. We did an audit. So America was paying the entire defense budget of the Cambodian military from 1970 to 1975. And there was an audit done in 1972, and it was found that only 5% of soldiers were actually receiving their pay. So the rest of it was all getting siphoned off to corruption, to these ghost soldiers, which would later become a tremendously big problem in Afghanistan. The dictator of Cambodia was confronted with these figures. They said, did you know that only 5% of soldiers are actually getting their pay? And he said, calm down. The Americans are killing 1,000 of our enemies a week. Victory is ours. Now, Kissinger's retrospective on Cambodia was that we actually didn't put enough into Cambodia. He thought if we only would put more military aid and drop more bombs, we actually would have won in Cambodia. And I think it's really ironic that these recycle the exact arguments we just had in August of last year, but put enough into Cambodia. We put $9 billion of military aid in Cambodia, and we dropped more bombs on Cambodia than all of World War II combined. So it's a little bit hard to see how more intervention would have built a more effective Cambodian military, and arguably was weak in part because of large-scale American support, not despite. And the second thing is that foreign sponsorship, in some cases, actually incentivized radical or risk-taking behavior by client regimes. So, the sense of invulnerability brought on by foreign sponsorship enabled radical domestic and international policy decisions. So it's not really well appreciated, but the Soviet Union, especially after 1945, was actually a fairly conservative world power. It actually mostly tried to get its clients to walk back more radical policy measures because it feared that they would end up weakening themselves and requiring more Soviet intervention. And so in Afghanistan, shortly after the coup in 1978, which brought the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan to power, the head of Soviet foreign intelligence met with the regime leader. And the regime leader said, what you guys did in 60 years, we're going to do in 5 years in Afghanistan. If you come back in a year, all the mosques will be empty. Now, he said this in, I think, June of 1978. And around that time, a large rural insurgency, led in part by religious conservatives, was starting to grow, which would end up dragging the Soviet Union into its largest war since World War II and ultimately destroying the regime. So Khrushchev came home to Moscow and said, I think they're crazy. Like, he was like, I can't believe they're saying, like, you guys need to way calm down. They were approached, the KGB was approached before the coup and said, would you guys support us in a coup? And they said, it's way premature. Don't launch a coup. Like, you're going to destroy the party. In South Yemen, unfortunately, I don't know the name of this Yemeni official, but they attacked North Yemen in 1979. He said, yeah, it's us. We started the war. If we win, we'll create a great Yemen. If we lose, you'll intervene and save us. Right? So there were consequences to foreign sponsorship beyond just regime survival on both the battlefield effectiveness of client militaries and in the domestic radicalism of client regimes. Okay, so that's the Cold War. What are the kind of legacies of this kind of stuff? So, in fact, after 1991, there are these kind of long-term autonomy of US-backed armies. The Thai military has proven stubbornly interventionist, despite actually having a much worse relationship with the United States now than it used to in the Cold War. And coups declined precipitously after 1991, but they did so not because kind of US-style armies can't launch coups anymore, or that we somehow solved the problem of coups in regimes that we assist, but because US hegemony, until arguably very recently, really reduced the attractiveness of holding power after a military coup. So when the Soviet Union was gone, the United States actually was able to the Cold War incentives to support client dictatorships disappeared along with the Soviet Union. And so countries that were no longer very geostrategically important for the United States came under pressure to democratize. And so the US and its European allies kind of punished coup makers much more consistently after 1991. But there are some reasons to suspect that that will change. There were 12 coup attempts in the last 2 years alone, which is substantially more than before. And as the US and China enter into something like multi-year bipolarity, this kind of US backing pro-US military regimes may end up kind of coming back as well, right? So militaries are not somehow worse at launching coups than they were before, and arguably the American model is actually the only real model of civil-military relations being promoted at all. And so the US, what we've done in sub-Saharan Africa is we build up these special forces that are aimed at counterterrorism, but are also really good at launching coups. And so in Guinea last year, forces went from literally a base where they were being trained by Green Berets to overthrowing the government. And so this is something that may end up coming kind of back. This might not just be a kind of Cold War story. And the second is, I think, there's this very underappreciated and ironic, and it's really apropos today, kind of strangely positive legacy for democracy, or arguably autocracy, in the former Soviet Union, is the Soviets left actually pretty strong civilian control over militaries in the former Soviet Union. They left a lot of other bad legacies for democracy, but military coups were not one of them. So coups in the former Soviet Union are actually extremely rare. And in part, people really want to know right now, is Putin going to get overthrown by a military coup? But he inherited a lot of the structures from the Soviet Union that make a military coup really difficult in Russia. So the military counterintelligence service of the FSB, the military counterintelligence department of the FSB, penetrates the army in the same way the Soviet special departments did. And they make it really hard for a coup to be launched in Russia. And these large internal security services, which kind of balance against the army, were also inherited by post-Soviet elites. And so, on the one hand, this meant militaries aren't overthrowing post-Soviet governments, which is kind of good for democracy. But it also means we shouldn't look to a kind of military coup as a likely kind of endgame for Russia right now. And I can talk about that later. But finally, so coups are probably not going away. The United States is still training foreign militaries. The Russians are much more into this game too, and the Chinese are increasing. And partisan armies are actually not entirely a thing of the past either. So we know actually based on captured documents that the Islamic State had actually a relatively similar domestic civil political order to the kind of Soviet model. So they had both a large security service with a counterintelligence wing embedded alongside their regular military commanders, and they had a series of kind of clerical kind of commissars, essentially, embedded alongside their military commanders to monitor their political reliability. So Iran actually has a similar system, the Sazman units, which monitor the political reliability of the army. And so, this type of model is not kind of completely a thing of the past either. Thanks.
Thank you for the presentation. So I learned a lot, particularly the part using the declassified document to analyze the great powers, like strategy and intention. That part is really impressive. So my question is that, so here you consider the heterogeneity across great power, which is useful, I think, but how about heterogeneity over time, like in different international systems, particularly like before, after the Cold War? Because my guess is that so the U.S. strategy may be very different, like before and after the Cold War. So
Yeah, it's a great question. So part of the problem is so one of the reasons I want to focus mostly on the Cold War period is I'm able to compare the Soviets to the Americans. And also the problem is there is a selection effect that happens after the end of the Cold War in which most autocracies find the end of the Cold War extremely challenging, and so many of them collapse. And so the ones that still exist tend to be more resilient. So like the types of autocracies that are still around after 1991 like do last in power longer, and it might not be because American sponsorship has changed since 1991. It's more because of the types of regimes that are still receiving foreign support are kind of systematically different. So there is some kind of heterogeneity there that is a bit of which is why I'm mostly trying to focus on the Cold War period. But that's a great question.
So first of all, I invite everyone who is watching on Zoom also to ask questions on Q&A, but I'll go ahead and ask one in the meantime. So I want to push you a little bit on American will and on Soviet capacity. Okay. So on the American side, it seems like, in a way, maybe this idea of aiding autocrats is a bit of a misnomer insofar as that what everyone's doing is aiding armies, right? And that what they really want to do is aid the armies. And in the American case, there's not really will there to actually aid autocrats in a meaningful way. And in a sense, that really what they want is, so if there's a coup or if someone takes over, it's sort of a test of strength, and what America wants is the strongest anti-communist force. So yeah, if someone can take over, they're clearly the biggest gorilla, so let them rule, right? So there's really, in a sense, it's not that they tried and failed to aid autocrats, but simply that they weren't interested. There was no will to aid autocrats. And then on the Soviet side, you get this idea of, it's kind of an astonishing finding, this total absence of coups, right, or successful coups. So there's this sort of impression that the Soviets had this real Midas touch where it came to actually, coup-proofing militaries. But then, there's the Ghana case, and so I'm not totally sure how to so is that a case where that's an attempt but failure, or is the idea that, no, basically, these institutions are so powerful, these institutions are so great, commissar system, it's so great that it's basically kind of a bulletproof approach? Or should the Ghana case maybe think that, as you said, there's this real risk in trying these strategies in the first place, because that's what could prompt the coup in the first place. So I wasn't quite sure how to resolve that.
Yeah.
That on the one hand, trying these strategies could prompt a coup. On the other hand, it never happened, but then in Ghana it did happen.
Yeah.
So help me think that through.
Yeah, I'll try to clarify that. So as for the first one, I think that essentially is my argument, and I think that it's kind of non-trivial in the sense that we still had all these reasons before this book to think that foreign support would have consistently helped autocratic regimes. And so the fact that American support actually doesn't, and I think it doesn't for the reasons you actually said, this kind of fundamental ambivalence about authoritarianism as such, and the kind of more interest in building a strong military capable of securing American interests, is in fact, I think, an interesting finding. But I essentially agree with that characterization. So as for the second one, so Ghana received basically almost no Soviet support in these efforts. And my argument is that, especially in cases where armies already existed, like in Ethiopia, South Yemen actually, Afghanistan, Somalia, the efforts to transform the security services along Soviet lines without actually prompting a military coup, that was done by the presence of thousands of Soviet advisors, which helped kind of disincentivize a reactive coup. So in Ethiopia, there were 12,000 Cuban combat troops protecting the regime as it made these unpopular changes. Same thing for Angola. So it's the presence of large-scale Soviet advisors. So even in Eastern Europe, when the Soviets were building these armies from scratch, the old army hated this, right? And they thought about ways to try to stop this from happening. But it was the presence of the Soviets that made it kind of impossible. It was kind of impossible for them to actually successfully resist these efforts. So other autocrats have tried and sometimes succeed in kind of copying the Soviet model. So Libya, under Gaddafi, implements large parts of the Soviet models, way more personalized, without large-scale Soviet support, kind of by luck, basically. I mean, he ends up succeeding, and you can, but the point is essentially that it's really difficult to get away with building these systems. And I think to understand how especially countries like Afghanistan and Ethiopia were able to build partisan armies, you have to look at the role of the Soviet Union and the role of Soviet advisors.
Right. So in a sense, so if we go back to that great Kissinger point, right? Yeah. So Kissinger says, well, we've done more, right? Which is clearly not true, unless what we mean is win the war as opposed to save the regime, right? I think what he means is winning the war.
He means winning the war,
right? So there's that. But so your argument would be then, if we took Kissinger's equivalent from the Soviet Union and said, we could have saved Nkrumah if we had done more.
Yeah.
You would agree with that argument.
I would, and Khrushchev agreed. Yeah. Khrushchev agreed. Yeah, the Soviets themselves also thought that, right? So the Soviets,
because they're building the right kind of institutions for protecting the regime.
Yeah. So the Soviets were really disheartened by what happened to Arbenz in Guatemala, who despite so the Americans were convinced he was like a communist stooge, and he wasn't. But the Soviets actually did want to support his regime, but they didn't really have the capacity at the time to actually do so. And so, they really wished they had been able to actually provide the amount of support to Arbenz in Guatemala that would have enabled him to consolidate his regime. Absolutely. That's a great question.
And what it's a very simple question is about, let's say, the military or state capacity. What about threats from without? Not say like coups, but something that happened in Afghanistan, that there was a revolution. So they're consolidating this army, they coup-proofing the army, but the regime may not consolidate. How effective were the Soviets in that regard?
Yeah, no. So both patrons, ultimately did have clients which were overthrown by insurgencies and wars. I think so. Did the Soviet model lead to poor battlefield effectiveness? It's a really good question, and it's one that is really hard to systematically evaluate because on the one hand, Vietnam has the kind of Soviet-style security services that are but Vietnam had a pretty effective military. Arguably, these institutions really were terrible in Ethiopia for battlefield effectiveness, and so I don't know. I mean, it's hard to say something systematically. You start getting to relatively low numbers when you're looking at how many of them fell to insurgencies. We're talking about a handful of cases, so it's hard to say anything really definitive statistically, I guess, about that. But yeah, there is. I think that I would feel comfortable saying both patrons struggled to build effective armies, and I think that's actually something that is almost universally true. So if you think about, is anybody good at building foreign militaries? I think this is something that, how did the US spend $88 billion in Afghanistan and fail? Is a question a lot of people were asking in August. And did the Soviets succeed where we failed? On the one hand, their army, so the CIA had the exact same prediction for Afghanistan and the Soviets, and the Americans, they said 6 months. The Americans, it ended up being 2 months or something, 1 month. The Soviets ended up being 4 years. So it actually lasted a lot longer, but it did still fall to insurgents eventually. But it's really hard to say, were Eastern European armies effective? The CIA certainly didn't think so. They thought if there was going to be a war, that basically the Romanian army would desert en masse and not fight. So they thought basically these client militaries would end up being total liabilities on the battlefield rather than actually useful. And is the Korean army effective right now? I'm sure every US military advisor would say, yeah, it's really effective. But how do you know? It hasn't fought. It hasn't fought a war since 1953. So could the Korean army fight without 2 weeks of US logistics assistance? I don't know. I mean, anyways, these are, I think, yeah, it's basically a general problem that it's really hard to build effective militaries from the outside. It's probably hard to build effective militaries in general, but it's probably really hard to build them from the outside. So that's a great question.
question, Adam. Actually, I have a couple questions. First question, you mentioned earlier like the history of the American military and how it was kept small intentionally. I'm just curious, like the point when the military actually expanded, because even before World War II, I mean, it wasn't really seen as that strong of a military, right?
For sure. I think so. I don't remember the exact statistic, but I think we had a smaller military than Belgium before the war. So the US military grew in steps. So basically, it would increase during the war, and they would always be bigger than it was before the war, but not by much. It kept going like, whoop. It was like building like this. And it wasn't until World War II where like a large, permanent, standing military would become the American military. And what's interesting is Korea allows you to actually see the transformation in like the US's own military and the militaries they built abroad. So right away, they built a constabulary. They were like, well, the Koreans don't need like a big army. They just need like a nonpartisan kind of national police force that will like keep order and kind of good government and secure our interests in Korea. And then during the war, that constabulary did terribly, and they ended up changing it mid-war to a much more conventional kind of what we would call like a modern army. But yeah, like that changed over time, and it really wasn't until World War II that the United States had like a kind of more permanent and the kind of army we now know today.
And my second question is, I'm sorry if I missed this detail during the presentation, but how does the number of client regimes, both like American funded and Soviet funded, how does that number actually compare?
Yeah, so in part because American clients lose power so many times, there's like 35 American clients and there's like 19 Soviet.
So can you give us, I know this is kind of early days on this, but do you have some initial findings or initial take on the British and French cases?
Yeah, so
how did they
I kind of don't
fare?
want to talk about the British and French. No, I mean, I will right now, but I meant in the book. So the French coup problem is like even worse than the American one. French-based clients are actually in certain models like statistically more like significant increase in the risk of coups by being a French client. There's a lot of different reasons why that's the case. I think that the problem with the British too is there's not that many regimes and they're really weird. So they're like, half of them are overthrown in military coups. So they're almost all Middle Eastern monarchies that end up being. So the British, like after World War II, don't sponsor a lot of autocratic regimes. Actually, they're mostly kind of get out of this game. But they do sponsor a handful of kind of Arab monarchies, and 3 of them are overthrown in coups, and 3 of them aren't. So it just kind of make like. I don't know. It's only 6, so, and then the other 3 become U.S. clients. So it's really, it's hard to say anything systematic about the British. But in terms of the actual armies they built, they're really similar. So the French model, the one slightly difference, which may actually account for the increased coups, is the French built larger non-military internal security services. So the gendarmerie, which then kind of posed a potential kind of threat to the army. But otherwise, the British built, really similar. The British built more specialized internal security services than the Americans, but otherwise, like pretty similar models, like nonpartisan armies that look broadly similar to the United States. Because our army was in part like a reflection of theirs too. Like West Point studied French military doctrine for most of its history, so I mean, we just sort of, we're a kind of Prussian-style army, so we sort of copy that mode of Western Europe. But that's a good question.
So I'm not sure if this is entirely related to what you spoke, but I was just wondering if there is between the Russian support and the American support, if there is any difference between, if there is any sort of urban-rural divide in terms of expertise. Because when one considers the case of Afghanistan, for example, the cities fall the last, but the countryside is probably gone, like for a while. So I was just wondering if there is any difference in the way they trained the armies, like both the Soviets and the US. Was there any sort of emphasis? I don't know, the US seems pretty urban, like the focus seemed, at least in...
Yeah, that's a great question. So the Soviets, so I'm not an expert specifically on like the economic development policies of the two, but the Soviets did, they pushed the regime to engage in a less radical land reform. They thought they were too weak on the countryside and wanted to focus on like expanding the party's urban base. So they were kind of both somewhat urban focused in terms of what they kind of pushed the regimes to do. And the Soviet model for it was like holding key cities kind of, and then like attacking insurgents in kind of different like interventions from these posts. So they actually kind of followed like broadly similar military approaches to counterinsurgency in Afghanistan. But the Soviets in general, the Soviets spent a lot of money on a few clients. So Cuba was costing Moscow $5 million a day for the late 80s. And Mozambique, basically, by the time they got Soviet support, the Soviets were like, we're not going to give you economic aid. Like, we'll build your military, but we're not going to give you economic aid. So the Soviets, when their own economy especially started getting much, much worse, they just like didn't have enough money to give. They didn't want to give precious foreign currency earnings to clients. But yeah, I would say also, that what I want to emphasize is the armies are organized very differently, but they both, do combined arms operations. They're both kind of conventional militaries, right? Like the Soviet Red Army and the American Army are both conventional militaries. They just have a very different political organizational structure. But like Soviet advice for, like I think it tactically, I'm not an expert on military tactics, but was slightly different than American advice. But it's not like it was crazy different what they were giving to the Ethiopians, for example, in the war. So that's a great question.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked about kind of the social side of it because, so as you say at the outset, you're political scientists, you invite interruptions. It also means you have to invite people asking about unobservables.
Yeah,
right?
for sure.
Okay, so you come in very, very clearly, very strongly and say it's the institutions, right? It's a resolutely institutional account for why we see the difference that we see. And I'm just wondering, is there anything else about, say, military recruitment or the way that militaries interact with society, anything else at all that you think is kind of like a threat to this argument or a wrinkle to this argument or something that could move us from a kind of almost like a muscular monocausal argument about institutions to one that says, well, so for instance, like something about, I mean, where does the Lon Nol regime actually recruit soldiers, right? I mean, these kinds of questions, like the urban, the rural, the class basis, the having, military academies be another kind of institution, of course, but like, just is there anything sociological, anything coalitional that you say, yeah, that also might matter, at least on the margin. So kind of a missing variable here, even if it doesn't outperform the institutions, which just provides such a compelling account for the variation at a large scale.
Yeah, that's a good. I mean, obviously, I wouldn't want to say that this is the best way to explain every aspect of these different regimes. I just think we can kind of understand a lot of this variation with this kind of relatively simple argument. But yeah, I mean, both types of client armies were almost press gang type recruitment. Like we're kind of pushing people into fight. Like the Afghan army under the Soviets had like massive desertion rates. Like they could not get soldiers to actually want to fight in the army. Same with even Mongolia, which was much more penetrated by the Soviets. In 1932, there was an uprising and just like mass desertions. People just left the army. They didn't want to fight. So, I think both really struggled with that. I think, and I think the story I'm trying to tell here is more about, which types of armies can overthrow their own governments. I think both struggled with building kind of cohesive armies that were good at fighting wars and that kind of other things that armies do. But yeah, no, I mean, I wouldn't want to make the strong claim that there's nothing else. I don't know that it's hard for me to think of like a kind of sociological level variable that would explain the kind of observed variation in the way we're seeing, but that doesn't mean that stuff's not absolutely important. Yeah, for sure.
One thing to think about, something about Vietnam here, right? So you're talking about desertion, and so clearly in Vietnam, right, the Viet Minh is built through, I mean, it's recruitment, right? It's recruitment for a nationalist revolution, right? And so you wind up presumably the military is, that gives you a certain kind of military. I mean, you more than anyone know how much revolutions themselves matter, right? So there's the revolution, which might be kind of collinear with, like often correspond with also this Soviet sponsorship. But that itself, you think about these Soviet-sponsored armies, one that comes to power in that kind of way. Yeah. So Vietnam would be like overdetermined in a way here, right?
Vietnam would be overdetermined, yeah.
Exactly. So that just seems like at least worth sort of wrestling with. Is that like, okay, that's another thing beside just the kind of these, engine room features of militaries that points us toward a more loyal or a real partisan army, right? Even before the Soviets really built it, they had it in a way that, say, Ghana didn't, right? And so there's sort of, that's just one example, but I think it's just kind of worth thinking about what are some, like, complexifiers in a way, not to make you sort of retreat from your model, but to just sort of say, to give us a kind of a richer historical account of how these, loyal or disloyal armies came to be. you
So
know?
that's a very well taken point. I think there's 3 ways to get a kind of Soviet-style partisan army that's relatively loyal to the regime. One is you can luck out. The second is that you can have Soviet assistance in doing it, or the third is you can have your own revolution where you create an army from scratch. But I think that this is still a helpful, so for these revolutionary cases, and I'm sure Lucan isn't watching it, so I think like, Angola, I think you actually have an easier time understanding why the Angolan regime was durable by looking at the Soviet role in helping subordinate the army to the party than in their revolutionary origins. Because when the MPLA came into power in 1975, the political leadership spent the entire war in exile and had effectively no control over its own military. These guys like sat out the war, in relative comfort in these kind of foreign capitals and solicited aid to send to the army. But the army commanders are the guys who actually fought the war. And the exiled commanders were so afraid of their own army, they wouldn't come to the capital for the first 13 months in which they could actually come. They were too afraid of their own army. And there were 2 plots by the Angolan army to kill its own political leadership. So this was hard to say that as coming out as a durable regime until all of a sudden, thousands of Cuban combat troops and thousands of Soviet advisors, thousands literally, of Soviet advisors pour in and help the Angolans consolidate partisan control over their own army. And they build a new KGB-style security service to monitor that army that puts down a coup in 1977. So I think revolution is absolutely a really important part of the Angolan story, but you could imagine a very different kind of regime emerging in 1975 than a party-dominated Angolan regime, which I think my argument would help you understand that a little bit better. So these are just from a bunch of very annoying to access documents. These are the advisory figures in sub-Saharan Africa, and I think the interesting thing is Guinea-Bissau, which is this guy, it's a nominally Marxist-Leninist regime. It has no Soviet military advisors. So I think I included this slide only to say not every Marxist-Leninist ostensibly regime actually was a Soviet client. Guinea-Bissau got no interest from the Soviets. And here you can see Somalia was their largest client until they're all kicked out in 1978. So anyway.
Great example. That's a great way of just looking at kind of the treatment in a way, right? So Angola, Vietnam, and think about the value added.
So Ethiopia gets there most, that's the red. And then Angola's that black line, and they have a lot of advisors. So I mean, they just get a ton of, we're talking 1,000 Soviet military advisors, and then a lot more Cuban combat troops to protect the regime So that I think the exiled leadership would not have been able to consolidate control over their own army, but for the Soviet Union.
Excellent. Well, this is fantastic. Thanks so much for sharing all this research with us. So just so everybody knows, we're going to be meeting again in 2 weeks, and we'll be gathering to talk about the theme of capitalism and democracy revisited. We've got an amazing panel put together for that, and that will be on Zoom. But I want to thank Derek Groom for putting this all together. Thank Chris for co-sponsoring. Thank Adam, most of all, for providing with all this food for thought. So thanks again, everybody, for coming, and hope to see you around soon.
Thanks, everybody.